Oh, okay. So sorry that hasn't been a video for a while. I'm going to explain why. So I'm traveling in Lisbon at the moment, or living in Lisbon. Just moved out here for 3 months, which is pretty nice, but it's getting hot, so it's tough to work. This AFL kind of concept and case study that we've been building out is basically complete now. I'm going to explain a few things as well, because I've actually done everything already, but I realized we're only on episode 5, and it kind of went better than I thought. We've started betting it for near enough full units already, so I can't really talk too much about the in-between parts, just because performance and the ROI is actually better than I was expecting. So yeah, I'll just get to it. So the last one, we basically vibe coded the scraper. That actually took a lot longer than I thought it was going to in the end. I don't know whether the site just has tons of anti-scraping or anything like that, but we did use Manus as well, which is another AI out of China. But the Claude 3.7 was the winner in quotes, just because that's what actually ended up working for the output of the scraper and in the best format. So everything else was like half okay, but just wasn't quite there. Like, it would come out with some player data and then it would miss the match data, and then when we switched one thing, the date would be wrong, and it was just all a bit of a mess. So that's one point I wanted to kind of make here, is that whether you're using this for the scraper builds or the actual model builds or something like the converter, which I'll get onto in a second, it's good to track which of these like AI LLMs or AI models work best for your personal projects or, different sports, because one might understand your prompting and context better for, say, scraping, and one might be better for the converter, which I'll get onto in a second, or like the main meat of the model build. So something like, based on this data set, this JSON data set, and our goals of making a profitable sports betting prediction model, how do we then merge those things into a structure that we can then optimize and calibrate our parameters for? Those kind of things are very different, like, even though they're all in the coding sphere. So you might look at like the top, highest on the programming language test, for example, or, just first in programming on OpenRouter. But the problem with those things are it's first for other things that aren't really what we're trying to do. So instead, just track what works best for you. For me, Claude has always been top since it was about 3.5, the first version, in October last year, I think, late October. That's when everything really started to click, and we just went from kind of doing things semi-manually to just scaling beyond the speed that I would have thought possible. Building an entire league from scratch that I've never watched a game of in my life to profitability in about, less than 20 days is pretty legit. And now with the new Claude 4.0, which is about a week old as of recording this video, that's helped even more, although I don't think the jumps are becoming as big as people say. So I think the Claude 4.0 versus the 3.7 isn't as big as the hype, I guess. But use whichever one works best for you. So if you are to this point, well, which I'll talk about here, but the other thing you'll need is something called a converter script. So this is basically where you have your raw JSON scrape data, but it's going to be really unusable. So in most cases, it's just going to be like a raw data dump, where in that case, we want to have a converter script that basically we can run once per, if you scrape an entire season, then once per season. And then when you're betting, prediction games or live games, or updating the model after a round of games is finished, we want to run that scrape data through this converter script to append or add to the existing matches data. You can use any terminology you want, just keep it consistent. So if you have like a matches JSON data, just call it matches.json. And, if you're doing season data, 2025.json, just so you keep things really, really organized. Because as this kind of scales and expands and gets more kind of complex, it can really easily kind of have one file you're working from that isn't the right one. So for example, we had multiple matches files that were slightly different, and then that resulted in some inaccuracies with like how we were building on the model. So if you're just using, say, 2025, 2024 data, don't include the older ones that would still be included for players that don't play that often. Hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, I'm just self-taught, so I just call this a converter script because that's what it does. I'm sure there's a fancy name for it. And then yeah, this is another job for the Claude.ai. But unlike the coding, the vibe coding approach that I kind of went through in the scraper video, this one I would actually spend time to like really write out an in-depth prompt. So it would be, a few hundred words long. It would have screenshots. It would have goals of what you're trying to achieve, what you're then using the data for in the future. So any context is in there, and just make one really good prompt. And each step, so saying this is the script, or this is kind of where it says date, this date is in the wrong format. It needs to be in year, month, day. So then that gets done. Then this home team is flipped. So for some reason it's, with the American sports, it's usually away team at home team. With Europe and the rest of the world, it's usually home team listed first. So just make sure you don't mix those things up as well. When you're appending odds, if you do that manually, that's fine. Obviously, you shouldn't make mistakes. If you build a appending script, which isn't just another thing that we do, just make sure that appends to the right way round and verify 1, 2, 3% of games manually to make sure. All of these things. So by the end of this section, you should have this done. So you should have a scraper that you can actually get all of the match data from. For previous seasons, this might take hours and hours to run. For the AFL, I think our scripts took 10, 12 hours each season, because we wanted to add delays in for the anti-scraping stuff. There wasn't that many games actually, so it might have been a bit less. Might be thinking of a hockey tournament, but if you have, say, 800 games in a hockey league and each game takes about a minute to run, you can see how this kind of gets out of hand. So especially if you need to run this on a computer that is, not a programming computer, just bear in mind you need, stable internet, and also things like just run it overnight so you don't have to worry about if anything goes wrong. Converter, that's what I was just on about. So it converts your scrape data into a usable format. Then verify this. I like to do between 2 to 3% of matches. So just take those games, go and review them manually, make sure everything matches up. Because obviously it's scraped and everything is consistent rules and algorithms. If there's no mistakes on 2-3%, it's unlikely to be mistakes on anything. And then you, based on what we were talking about in the early episodes here, some knowledge about the sport in question is kind of important because this is what you need for this model building section. And then some core edge ideas. So if you remember episode 2, we talked about edge concepts that might not be baked into the betting line properly or at all, or even inverted. So something like sometimes obvious things are over compensated for in betting lines. So a really silly example would be like goals in football, right? So if we said, or soccer, sorry, if we said, if we just built a goals model that said whoever scored the most goals in the last 10 games, chances are that's probably, even though it's a silly example, or we could do shots, for example, chances are that's probably overfit. So like people who take more shots is more desperation, and hence they are usually behind in game situations and so on. We can create like a million reasons why. It's easier to just backtest it. So once you have all of this, you can kind of go on to this main model build section. So I actually finished this a while ago, a few weeks ago. But as I mentioned, I'm not going to show a massive amount of this just because we have had pretty good success with it. And I don't want to risk any like reverse engineering of things. So the keys though are twofold. So I'm just going to run through these. Start with a structure in mind. That's easy to edit each individual parameter so you can see what impacts what. So even if your editing of parameters is bad, it's actually pretty good. So if X parameters increased or decreased, do we bet more or do we bet less? So such as when stat weightings are higher, say the shots or the goals example, do results get worse or better for favorites, underdogs, home teams, away teams, whatever? it's good to have that information and just to know it, especially if you have 1 or 2 seasons of data, which is another point. What I recommend doing is having 1 season you work on a model like this. So you use all of these things, which I'll get onto calibration in a second, but you basically build the model based on 1 season and then you test it against another. There's obviously machine learning processes that talk about like test data versus trial data, or like whatever it's called. But I found that if you do an entire season, it's enough games where variance evens out. If you do half a season, sometimes you might think, okay, this is only a 3% ROI on half the season, but that could have been the bad half. And if the other half is 15-20% and it evens out at about 8 to 10, you might be missing something just because you don't think it's very good, but that might be the variance chunk. Whereas if you're having only like a 2-3% ROI in this, when we talk about this, that's obviously not great for these low to medium competition sports. Obviously, if you get that on game day of NFL, beautiful, take that to the bank. But in these situations, you want to have a lot higher ROI just because your liquidity is a lot lower and your volume might be quite low as well. So this is why I do it this way in terms of the individual start weighting of players or teams. So you need to do this without overfitting. This can be obviously pretty difficult because you do want to keep your volume of bets high, and the more you overfit or the more you kind of qualify games, your volume will decrease. But I also don't mind a little bit of overfitting as long as it doesn't fall into this range situation. So if you hear people saying, I take a team when they are between X and X, or their stats are between X and X, I really don't like that, because that's kind of same in trading. You have really dangerous things that are in ranges, which are a lot easier to overfit when you have a range parameter than when you just have greater than or less than X. Okay. And then if you have differential of X, that's fine. So like team 1 stat versus team 2 stat to give you just a raw static integer or a raw static value rather than just a, between X and X and then between X and X. You just add like levels that, in my opinion, make stuff more likely to be noise than signal. And then the results. So the ROI has been pretty good so far. We have a V4 and a V5. I wrote about why I like having these 2 versions in this post. You can go and give that a read if you're interested. The short version is basically A, it protects you against that signal and noise issue. B, they're based on different things. They're similar, but not quite the same. We have this in our rugby model as well and our cricket model, where we have a V5 and V6, and V5 might like accidentally or be calibrated to favor underdogs, whereas V6 is just more calibrated to individual player performance. So that can be more skewed to good teams. So it kind of works well when they align. It's very, very profitable. And then when they misalign, it usually helps you reduce unit sizing from, say, like 1 unit to maybe a half. And those plays tend to be a lot weaker in general. We don't have the data on like that just because it's less common, but it's something I would recommend. So I'm going to go and open up these models and show you some results, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so this is the AFL version 4 that I was talking about. You can see all of these different scripts that we have in here: fixed match data, the converter script I was talking about, the raw matches, backtest results, etc. Team ratings, player ratings, main data processing. I'm not going to go into those again because, again, that's kind of, I guess, proprietary, although you sound like a bit of a individual when you say things like that. But this is just profitable for us, so I can't reveal exactly what's in here. I'll run console now and just show you the output. And then this, I'm hoping this is just going to be motivation for people of where, somebody like me that doesn't have any idea of coding as of a year ago can then build something like this for multiple sports and make 10, 12%, 15% ROI on medium liquidity sports really easily and be able to travel at the same time and just earn off of this from anywhere. That's kind of the motivation behind this series, I guess. There's not a lot of like really narrow niche sports modeling content. Most of the podcasts, even though I like the individuals behind them, I find quite weak nowadays. They're a bit disconnected. So yeah, I'm going to run this and then I'll come back and talk about the results. So you can see 11% ROI, 32 units, 130, 104 for about 55.6%, with a healthy total bets over 2.5 seasons. ROI pretty consistent, slower this season so far, so that might be something to keep an eye on. Edge should increase as things increase. Something like this is probably a red flag for a lot of people. I'm not too bothered with things like this, but in general, as your points edge increases, your ROI should increase as well. I like to split things into medium and high confidence. So things like medium confidence might be too many new players that we don't have data on. So you can see that performed really, really badly. So we should be ignoring all of those really, but we're still including them for some reason. So it might be something to look at there. You can see in general, earlier performance tends to be a little bit worse than second half of the season. You'll see that quite a lot as well. But in general, if you have a good amount of bets with a decent ROI with profit in the kind of like, I'd say, as long as you have over 20 units per sport, that's okay. 15 units minimum per season is probably a good thing to aim for. In this case, because we didn't have much data on prior players, there's not a lot of bets in this season. So there's only, 50 bets versus the next season, a lot more. And even you can see here, way more. Sizing is important. So 53% in general wouldn't give you a good ROI. But because this is +4 and a bit units, we're pretty healthy. So just remember to kind of calibrate based on that as well. And last thing I'll mention, build something that's like good for your personality. So for me, I don't really want to think loads and build a model once and then just kind of forget about it for a little while until I revisit it, do 12 hours a day flow state for a week and then leave it again for months and only come back to it if things are not looking right. That tends to be what works for me. And then it should just give me a number. I bet it. I know that if I bet it enough times, I'm going to have a 10, 12% ROI, and then I can just leave it. That's what works for me. Other people will prefer to have lower volume, higher ROI. Some people will have super high volume, low ROI. Again, it's just your personal preference. Make the model kind of calibrated to you as well. I don't think that's something that's talked about a lot of. It's talked about a lot in trading, which is where I get most of my ideas from, but it's not talked about a lot in professional sports betting. So yeah, that's everything. I'll try and do some more videos soon, especially when I'm back. But any questions, let me know. You can get in touch through any of the methods as well. All right, cheers.